I am absolutely delighted to welcome Paul Prettitore this afternoon to speak to us about developing land markets to promote resilience in FCV-affected settings. Paul is currently a senior land administration specialist at the World Bank. He's based in Zagreb, Croatia, and has worked on land conflict issues in Bosnia and Herzegovina, Croatia, Palestine, Syria, Iraq, the Philippines, Colombia, Kosovo, Angola, Burundi, and Uganda. And he's going to speak to us more about issues related to land conflicts today. So I'm going to hand over to Paul. He's going to speak for 40 to 45 minutes, and then we'll have some time for questions from those in the room and from those of you online also. So I'll hand over to you, Paul.
Thanks very much. It's really nice to be back at Queen's University. So thank you for the Institute for Global Peace and Security and Justice for organizing today's event. So just a little bit more about me and my experience is that I started my career in human rights in Bosnia in 1998, so shortly after the conflict, where, because I was a lawyer, was immediately tasked with dealing with land restitution, which I worked on in Bosnia for several years. And after that, joined the World Bank, where on different occasions we've given advice to governments of Colombia, the Philippines, and numerous other places on issues of addressing land administration and conflict. So the reason I'm here today is because we've started a research program called Developing Land Markets to Promote Resilience in FCV-affected settings. So a super complicated title. That's usually the way these things work out. The concept behind the research was that, at least within, so like the World Bank is a big development organization. Not everyone is a land administration specialist. Obviously, there's actually a super small number of us at the World Bank. So part of this was kind of to dispel some of the beliefs about what happens in a conflict situation when it comes to land. So, for example, one of them was that, okay, conflict starts and all land transaction stops. But this isn't true. Land transactions continue. Markets, real estate markets thrive sometimes during conflict. So it was an idea to get a better understanding of how these markets are working in situations of fragility or conflict or violence, and how those markets could potentially be manipulated to provide resilience instead of just looking at the negative impacts. Are there ways that we can try to influence positive impacts from these markets? And part of it is just very practical. So on one hand, we have like the research. So what do we know what's going on? What do we know about interventions? What do we think has worked and not worked? But how do we turn that into practice? It's sometimes much easier to write a paper, but then to go into a country and develop a project that's supporting land administration in somewhere like Colombia or now Syria or Ukraine presents a lot of obstacles and challenges. So what do we do with this knowledge that we're developing? How do we turn policy into practice? So first, I don't think it's any big surprise what some data tells us. Number one, that in fragile states, you have weaker perceptions of land tenure. So we have been for several years cooperating with Prindex, which is probably the most extensive global data set when it comes to perceptions of land tenure. So again, this is just perception. This is what people think about the strength of their land tenure rights. So when you look at the Fragile States Index and Prindex data, what it shows you is that in fragile states, you have weaker perceptions of land tenure. Again, where there's less peace, there's weak property rights. So if you're looking at the data from the Bertelsmann Transformation Index and the Global Peace Index also shows a clear trend that, a lack of peace means a bit of a lack of property rights. In context of FCV, there are higher perceptions of tenure and security. So this chart is based on the World Bank's classification of what countries are FCV, which we could have a whole another presentation about the methodology behind that. I think anyone looking at this, would recognize that there's quite a few countries I would think of as FCV that are not really appearing on these charts. These are just ones that Prindex had information data for, which not every country in the world either. But more broadly, what we learned from some coordination with Prindex and getting access to their data was that of the countries where they surveyed, it was around 23% of the adults surveyed said that their property was insecure. So this is a rise of 4% between 2022 and 2024 and represents about 1.1 billion people globally. So that's quite a big portion of the world that sees that there is some threat to their land tenure security. In FCV countries, these perceptions can change really quickly. And this is one thing we've talked about working with Prindex a bit more extensively about is, what is the driver of perception? One day everything's fine and a week later everything can be terrible. So perceptions can change rather abruptly. Between 2022 and 2024, land tenure, perceptions of tenure and security in Ukraine went up 23%, in Mozambique 19%, but in Burkina Faso they dropped 23%. So in conflict countries, you can see these wide fluctuations about how people perceive their tenure security. And that's important because people act based on their tenure security, whether it's investment in the land or protections of the land. If there's some threat to ongoing access to the land, people are going to treat the lands quite differently. So we did another in-depth study with data from Prindex in cooperation with Prindex, and a couple of interesting things came out. So one is that organized violence was seen as kind of a leveler of perceptions of tenure security. So if you took some proxy for household wealth/income, across the board, whether people were from wealthier or less wealthy households, organized violence reduced their perceptions of tenure security. It was much worse for people who are renting versus owners, but all wealth categories saw a decline. What we also saw was that organized violence pushed people to less secure forms of housing. So people were no longer living in housing or land that they owned, but they were moved to renters. So for example, you're displaced from one place to another and then you're forced to rent, or they were living with families or friends. There was also a negative impact, a long-term negative impact on people's sense of tenure security. This impact lasted as long as 28 years and was equivalent to low income or low education. So the fact that organized violence was present had a direct and rather drastic impact on people's perceptions of tenure security. Okay, so I mentioned before the concept behind this, and it marries quite three different elements, which sometimes makes it a bit challenging. And everyone defines these elements a little bit differently. For FCV, at least from the World Bank perspective, I think the important thing to keep in mind is that it's a multidimensional risk to security and to livelihoods and to social stability. When it comes to land markets, we're taking a broad view of land markets. So it's any kind of transaction in land, but not just buying and selling land. For example, allocation of social housing, allocation of public land, land grabbing, land confiscation or expropriation, formal or informal, by states or by non-state actors. So we're really looking at any ways that land changes hands during a situation of FCV. Resilience, the bank does a lot of work on resilience. Traditionally, this has been geared much more towards disaster risk mitigation. So protection against things like earthquakes, wildfires, floods, droughts. But this is slowly being adapted to the conflict context as well, because a lot of the principles are also applicable So if you think of prepare, recover, and grow, how do you prepare for conflict and violence? How do you recover from it? And how do you use it as an opportunity to grow? Within the disaster risk mitigation sector, there's a lot of discussion around the idea of build back better, which we're trying to incorporate into land administration as well. I will get to that a little bit later with some other slides. But also part of the reason that the concept, at least for us, is important is that, at the World Bank, we work on a number of different sectors. And development assistance and government funding is limited. And governments have to make choices about prioritizing. So it's always important for us to explain to them why something is important, what the impacts are, and why this deserves funding or at least attention versus something else. So first, the policy perspective, and this is what I like to call the why we should care portion of the work. Again, like working in an organization with people from a lot of different sectors, I'm often having conversations with colleagues who are economists or social protection specialists, and you tell them something and they say, okay, that sounds really horrible, but why should I care? I mean, why is this important in a development context? I've had a lot of trouble with this question in my other field of research, which is access to justice, which is even harder to gain attention for. But again, it's this multidimensional approach to this, and you really have to be able to explain why this is worth investment and what happens when you choose not to invest. So, the bank has done a lot of policy research on the issue of FCV. There's the World Development Report from 2011. There's the Pathways for Peace report, which I want to say was 2019, but I could be wrong. This was done in cooperation with the UN, and they set a lot of the parameters for the bank's engagement in FCV context about what's important. So I think some of the more important general policy considerations include, FCV affects many people globally. There's estimates that somewhere around 60% of the extreme poor will be living in countries classified as FCV by the year 2030. All we have to do is open the news or social media and see that FCV is as present as it has ever been in the world. There's particular FCV impacts on the poor and vulnerable, so they tend to be hit hardest when FCV factors are taken into account, and I think land administration and access to land is no exception to this rule. The social and the economic importance of land, I'll talk a little bit more about later, but so for example, for economic assets, so you have a job, you have savings, these can easily disappear when a conflict breaks out. So land as an economic asset becomes much more important. I've worked in post-conflict situations where at the end of the conflict, really the only economic asset people had left was land. So the importance of treating that as a valuable economic asset becomes very important, as are the social aspects, because land is often more than just a plot. It's where you live, it's where you have memories, it's where you have connections, but social attitudes tend to become a bit distorted during FCV, which also has an impact on things like land and housing. Governance breakdown. In situations of FCV, it's normal to have some sort of governance breakdown. So you have institutional decline. Institutions just may not be present anymore. They might not be able to provide services to people. They might be captured and only serve certain percentages of the population. Government institutions have been used to persecute and prosecute people who are seen as in opposition, so sometimes minorities and things like that. And also the increase of feelings of exclusion and mistrust. And I think trust is also a really big issue when it comes to land administration and access to land. You can also see the World Bank strategy on fragility, conflict, and violence. So this was from 2021 to 2025, which we all now can see has ended. There is a new strategy that is supposed to be released sometime this spring. I have not yet seen it, but we will be working from a new strategy sometime soon. But you see kind of the elements of the former strategy, which were around prevention, remaining engaged in active conflict. And that's something that's a little bit new for the World Bank. I mean, the World Bank was traditionally seen as, we're not a humanitarian institution, we're a development institution. And for a long time in this arena, there's been this sense of there's a humanitarian phase of the conflict followed by a development phase. And I think now there's much more of a recognition that the two kind of overlap and work simultaneously. So there's not a period when the humanitarian situation ends and the development one begins. I think there was also a tendency in some development organizations that it was better to wait till the conflict is resolved and then you step in and then you try to fix it. One of the things we've tried to push a narrative within the World Bank on this was, as a minimum, we need to stay engaged and aware and understand what's happening to land during an active conflict or fragility or violence. Because understanding how people become dispossessed, how is land grabbing taking place, are land records being destroyed, really helps you in the aftermath figure out, okay, what are the channels by which we can address this? So as a minimum, I think we have to stay aware of what's happening, even if we're not in a position to intervene. Transition from FCV, I mean, land is often a big component of peace agreements, of post-conflict transition arrangements, not only as a source of things like restitution and compensation, but you need land for housing, you need land for infrastructure. So even things like how is public land being used in a transition to meet needs, for example, demographic changes. A lot of conflict results in rural to urban migration. I think, at least in the places where I've worked, this tends not to be reversed, regardless of whether you have a restitution scheme. People move to urban areas, they tend to stay. How do you address that? You need land to do new housing, for example. And then again, to mitigate the impacts of FCV. So I think that plays into this idea of what can you do during an active conflict to make sure that vulnerable people don't suffer too much during the conflict, but also aren't put in a situation that's really difficult to address post-conflict. So the elements of land markets, I mean, I think there's so many different elements we could put up there and they all kind of overlap. So this is kind of just the initial thinking of trying to categorize them. So really looking at what are the elements that impact the land market. So what are forcing changes in the way that land is changing hands during situations of FCV? I mean, a couple where I think we've been a bit more engaged with in the past, at least analytically. So for one, you have land grabbing. I mean, in my experience with situations of FCV is there's always some sort of land grabbing going on. And this might be systematic. It might be, like it was in Syria during the conflict. It could be more opportunistic. Hey, my neighbor's not here anymore, and they're a refugee in Australia, so I'm just going to move into start cultivating their fields or take over their apartment. I mean, there's the kind of legitimate versus illegitimate, and we can have long discussions on what's legitimate land grabbing and illegitimate. But I think sometimes of legitimate, you're displaced from one place to another, you have nowhere to live, so you move into abandoned property, or you encroach on public property. I mean, it's a bit different than, hey, I'm going to kick out my neighbor and take over their apartment, which I always liked, or I'm going to expropriate all of the land from people who are from this religion or this sect. State actors are involved, non-state actors are involved. Colombia is another big example of land grabbing, which has not overwhelmingly been reversed. Land value. So this is an interesting one because The value of land tends to fluctuate quite dramatically during conflict. So several years ago, we worked on an urban review in Somalia. And one of the things we saw was how land transactions were very closely linked to, periods of stability. So when the fighting dies down a little bit, there's a lot of transactions going on. When the violence heats up, the transactions tended to stop. But then the value of the land is always kind of changing. Another thing that we saw in Somalia is, speculation. So people acquire pieces of land because they think, okay, 3 or 4 years ago, when the conflict ends, this is going to be really valuable land. Let me snatch it up now, and I'll just sit on it and see what happens. I mentioned hardened social norms. So I find this one of the really interesting elements because it's, I think, in some ways the hardest to predict and to deal with. So, for example, defensive displacement. We're going to drive out everybody who we see as a threat because they're a different religion or they're with a different political party. Segregation, very often in post-conflict situations or conflict situations, you end up with highly segregated geographical areas. I know from having worked in Bosnia after the conflict, for example, there was a massive restitution process. It involved over 200,000, it was about $220,000 claims for restitution. Within 6 years, about 95% of the claims had been adjudicated and enforced, which is really quite shocking. I mean, relatively short period of time and high enforcement and a high enforcement rate. But what happened in practice was that there were a lot of sales and exchanges of properties. So I got my ownership recognized, but I don't want to live there ever again, so I'm going to sell it to someone else. I'm going to exchange it. And interestingly, then I was working at this Office of the High Representative in Bosnia, and we started to get a lot of criticism from governments that the restitution process was a failure because people were selling and exchanging their properties. Because the political consensus then was that everybody should go back to where they were before the conflict, and then we have multi-ethnic Bosnia again. Otherwise, ethnic cleansing wins if people don't go back to where they came from. And it was interesting because there were even attempts to put some type of restrictions on restituted property. So if you had lived in what was a social housing at the time, which was 95% private property because you could pass it to your heirs and you couldn't be removed from it, but there was a regulation put in place that once you got that property back through the restitution, you couldn't sell it for 2 years. And this became really, really complicated because, again, it's one of the few economic assets people had, and you were taking away their ability to use that, to sell it, to buy a property somewhere else, or to fund a business. There were a lot of problems with enforcement. So, someone comes and knocks on your door at midnight, hey, are you really back living here? If you're someone who just returned, do you really want the police knocking on your door, making sure that you're living in your apartment? Or you go to the market and you come back and there's a note on your door that said, hey, we came, you weren't here. Next time we take your property away from you. So it was very much manipulated, and I'll talk a bit more about that later. But while we were doing a global study on land in conflict in 2019, we worked with Queen's University with Luke Moffat and Cheryl Lothar, because at the time we were looking at examples of conflicts where the peace agreement really didn't make much mention of housing and land and property rights. So we looked at Northern Ireland, so they did a bit of research about how HLP was being handled via the Good Friday Agreement. And I was rereading the paper again this morning to see if is there anything interesting I can say about Northern Ireland since I'm standing here. And one of the things that really struck me was how this whole issue of intimidation. So people were intimidated out of their properties, which is not uncommon in an FCV, although here I think it was often quite direct and personal, as opposed to kind of more communal in some ways. But the fact that intimidation could be used as a reason to get reassignment of social housing, and please, Lauren, correct me if I say anything incorrectly, but intimidation was one of the rationale for asking for reallocation of housing, social housing. And I think through the housing executive. And so one with the social housing, but also there were situations where they would purchase your private property because of intimidation. Yeah, I think. But the point being, what I found really interesting is that you had what was seen as a neutral, technical, and I think well-respected institution, the housing executive, which in some ways was doing the right thing because, hey, I'm afraid to live here, it's not secure, I need to move somewhere else. But through that, you ended up with highly segregated communities, which had a negative impact on investment and access to jobs and things like this. I think this is always one of these interesting conversations around the FCV and land agenda, because it's this entire issue of balance. So what are like I said, in Bosnia, we were criticized because we were giving people property back, but they weren't moving there. But security is such a big issue for people, and it's not something that can be resolved immediately. I mean, you can resolve housing relatively quickly. You can maybe do something on employment creation. You can give people grants. I mean, in Bosnia, we gave people cows and sheep and things if they wanted to move back to a rural area, or seeds. But it's one thing if you left your home because maybe your village was being shelled from, I don't know, 10 kilometers away, versus the police in my town came in the middle of the night and said, you leave now or we kill you. Or situations where people had family members disappeared, murdered, where people were raped. I mean, that's not a situation that people are necessarily voluntarily going to return to. So there's always this balance of how do you create, through land administration and restitution, opportunities versus respecting people's wishes, that sometimes people just don't want to live together, as difficult as it is to say and believe. So at least in Bosnia, our mantra was kind of, we're giving people opportunities, we're giving them their properties back. What they choose to do with them is completely up to them. I mean, it's private property, we can't interfere, and to some extent, maybe we shouldn't interfere. But it's always one of those difficult questions, and in my experience, from a political perspective, there's a tendency of governments, and we see this actually starting to emerge in Syria right now, is that the knee-jerk response is turn back the clock. In Bosnia, everything was April 15th, 1991. We go back to April 15th, 1991, and then everything is good. In Colombia, we worked with the government for a while with the land restitution unit, giving some kind of technical advice. And even in somewhere like Colombia, which had a relatively successful restitution process, and they did a good job of matching physical restitution of land in some cases with social and economic contributions. But even there, everything was premised on, you get benefits if you go back to where you were. You get benefits if you go back to your land. Even, I'll talk more about that a bit later, but again, it's this kind of balance of respecting people's rights, understanding the security situation, but still trying to provide them with some opportunities when it comes to land and housing. I also mentioned transactions. So transactions don't stop during FCV, they fluctuate. So for example, in Ukraine, after the Russian invasion, transactions mostly stopped. There was a block on transactions for quite a long time. The block was lifted. Now, if you look, I looked at the State Geocadaster's website the other day. In 2025, they registered 500,000 plots of land, corrected 100,000 land records, and registered 200,000 hectares of public land, all during an ongoing conflict. So things continue, but the bigger problem is the opportunities for things like fraud and duress. So for example, in Syria, during the conflict, we did a kind of using big data, so looking at social media and regular media posts about things like losing land in the city of Homs, to just get a sense of what's actually happening during the conflict, and just the level of fraudulent land transactions. So people knew who were displaced, they knew who wasn't around, so you forge a couple of documents and, now my name's in the land register, I sell it to someone else, we have a bona fide third party, it starts to become a bit irreversible. In Bosnia during the conflict, there were a lot of transactions during duress. So again, state or non-state military people show up your door and said, look, you either leave now or, we kill you and your entire family. And, but before you leave, we're going to make you sign over your property to us. I mean, this was not necessarily uncommon. So, back to the concept a little bit. It always becomes challenging to kind of frame these things. So if we're going to do this, it's like, what pillars are we putting into it? What is the viewpoint for looking at this? And I change this constantly, and it will probably change again. But I think it kind of reflects the way that we're trying to look at it and the elements that we think are probably the most important. So one is around, institutions and accountability, both of which tend to decline during periods of FCV. So how do we understand that decline, and how can we try to correct it? Land transactions, they fluctuate, but how do you put safeguards in place to make sure that it isn't improper land transactions and people are doing things freely? The third one is kind of the new one, which I've added, which I kind of like, but it's the most complicated, I think, is this idea of equity, which again is a bit cross-cutting. But coming from an institution that focuses primarily on poverty, and we know the impacts on vulnerable people, minorities, and the poor because of FCV, how is land equity and broader equity affected during a conflict? And again, how can access to land be used to mitigate some of this? And I always like to throw in the access to justice thing, because I think that's also really important. And then how do we frame them for resilience? So there's a big discussion around, what exactly is resilience. There's positive resilience, negative resilience. But, we can also look at it through the lens of land resilience and resilience beyond, because once you have land resilience, that creates a lot of other resilience, like economic or social resilience. But I think kind of the key concepts here that we're kind of facing more regularly is integrating land administration into this concept of Build Back Better. So a lot of post-conflict interventions in land administration, particularly things like restitution, tend to be done in a silo and not integrated with kind of the broader policy on how do we reconstruct things like infrastructure or society or economies, which I think is not always the best approach. I already mentioned, the restitution is sometimes turn back the clock, when in reality what you need to be doing is looking forward to the new realities. Some cities and places should not look the same as they did before the conflict because the population has increased, or maybe the population has decreased. So going back to the way things were aren't always the preferred option, but it's often a knee-jerk response, but it's also sometimes a popular response. I mean, people don't want to be told, your house is gone, but it's not really needed anymore, so sorry, or you should be living here and you shouldn't be living there anymore. For us, I mean, I think one of the big things around Build Back Better is making sure that land somehow contributes to the broader agenda. So investment in infrastructure requires land, investment in housing requires land, investment in agriculture often involves access to land. So how do we make sure that we're addressing the land elements of all of these things that make post-conflict recovery successful? When it comes to land transactions, I think one important aspect is, how do we maximize land services? So how do we work just regular land services? I want to buy and sell. I want something notarized. I want a mortgage. My father owned the land but was killed during the war, and now we have to go through probity and inheritance. How do we make sure that services are working well for everybody? Again, and a bit more controversial is, I think, how do we ensure that governments have the proper land tools, land management tools that are often required in a post-conflict setting? So, you know, one of the unpopular things in discussions is always expropriation. You know, sometimes governments need to expropriate property to do, I don't know, reconstruction, restoration. Sometimes it's, you know, addressing the fact that things were built maybe in a flood zone that never should have been built, or, you know, they need more high density housing, so things aren't going to return the same way. Things like land adjustment. So, hey, we're going to improve infrastructure, but we have to take a little bit of everyone's land, but you're going to benefit from it. Things like land consolidation, land pooling, all these tools need to be available to governments, but performed in a proper way to also achieve reconstruction. Equity. There's a lot around transitional justice schemes, which I'll talk about a little bit in a later slide. But again, I think it goes to ensuring that everybody has as equal opportunities to benefit from the land administration services, the public benefits of public land as possible. One practical way we've tried to address this is that we've had land administration projects in some post-conflict, fragile countries. I mean, two of them right now being Kosovo and Sierra Leone. So in addition to these land registration projects, we got grants from the State and Peacebuilding Fund in the bank, which also is sponsoring all of this research, which I should have started off with, but thanks to the State and Peacebuilding Fund. One thing we did is we went and we used this trust fund to get grant money, and we gave that grant money to civil society organizations. So we have civil society in Kosovo and civil society in Sierra Leone. We've also done similar one in Jordan during the Iraq War to benefit Syrian and Iraqi refugees, so the Syrian and the Iraq War, and also in Laos, which is a bit of a different situation. But the concept is all the same. We work with civil society to make sure that they deliver legal aid services around land administration and land registration to the most vulnerable communities. Governments in general and land administration institutions, so things like land registers, cadastre agencies, are very reactive in the sense of public sector. I'm selling a piece of property to you, we go to the land register, we go to the cadastre, everything's done. I need a document, I need something signed, I need to register something, you go. They're not institutions that go out into the public and say, hey, here are the benefits of this, please participate with us. They don't often reach these people, they don't know how to communicate with them, and there's often a level of distrust. We've found that working with civil society often helps bridge that gap. Long-term sustainability of legal aid is always a challenge, but if you do it around kind of a shorter-term land registration process, that risk becomes slightly less. So I mentioned at the start that we're kind of approaching this from two different ways, one being the policy, the other being the operational. So for the bank, you know, the term operations for us means we're loaning money to a government to do a project in a certain sector. This is called an operation, it's a project. And this is kind of the what can we do in these situations part of the discussion. So common interventions in the land sector that I've seen just in my career. So, you know, digitization of land records is a big one. Paper records are at risk of being destroyed, damaged, stolen. Making some digital records brings some level of security. I know that in Syria, during the conflict, there were big efforts, I think by IOM and a couple of other institutions, to basically digitize whatever records refugees were taking with them outside of the country, and storing that. Safeguards on transactions. So I know in Colombia, there was a period where you could go to the cadaster and say, I'm not selling my land. Put a mark on my land, and just so that you know I'm not selling it. So if anyone comes and says this land was sold to me, you know that it's incorrect. In Syria, they put freezes on land transactions, lifted them, put them back, lifted them. I've seen practices where it's like annulling or recertifying land transactions. So in Bosnia, basically the land legislation, the peace agreement said any transaction that took place between April 15th, 1991 and the end of the war in 1995 was annulled, unless both parties to the contract come forward and say, no, we agreed to it, it was voluntary. This was to deal with the issue of duress. In Kosovo, they set up an entire agency that's supposed to look at old cadastre records and make sure that that remains the basis for valid legal transactions, which leads to another problem, which I will discuss after this. The Build Back Better. How do we ensure that land administration is part of these broader efforts to rebuild infrastructure and society in post-conflict settings? Expanding protected forms of tenure. So I've seen this a lot, so Sierra Leone is a great example. Post-conflict, they passed extensive legislation that for the first time formally recognized customary tenure as a form of legally recognized tenure, but then needed to set up an entire process for registering this, which has proved incredibly challenging. I know places like Angola, I think Uganda and Burundi a long time ago looked also at these issues of how do we incorporate customary structures and customary forms of tenure, and even things like dispute resolution in a post-conflict situation. Transitional justice, which I will discuss a little bit after this. So, to the practical, in one of the bank's main analytical tools is called the resilience and disaster needs assessment. So these are country-level diagnostics that look at all of the different elements of resilience and disaster mitigation in a country, and kind of sees where the bank can add some benefit. So, like I said, this has been adapted from the disaster risk mitigation sector to uncover the broader governance and conflict agendas. So we've been contributing more and more to these when teams ask. So one example is Syria. So a couple of weeks ago, I got a call from a colleague working on Syria saying, hey, they're going to do the needs assessment. Is there anything we can pull together to, what are the conflict land elements of the recovery? So I think somewhere like there, the key elements were large amounts of land actually changed hands during the war. Huge amounts of land, whether it's expropriated or sold or, confiscated. Massive changes to the legal framework. So law changes, regulation changes about who can own property, how property is taken away from you, how property is registered, where property can be registered, destruction of land records, allegedly deliberate in several instances where, the land registry office just happened to be hit with a bomb, or land records were set on fire and destroyed. This on-again, off-again restrictions on transactions, when they can be made and by whom. Now they've also passed legislation that people that may have committed corruption during the Assad regime cannot transact in property because that property might be confiscated because it was an illicit gain. But these things are very complicated, and what it does is it often leaves land in limbo for a while because the systems for adjudicating these things are quite complicated and time intensive. One thing we've noticed is that there's kind of no comprehensive policy coming out from the new government about how they're going to address land administration in a maybe not post-conflict, but semi-post-conflict situations. So we see a lot of fragmentation of policies. So and a lot of this knee-jerk, let's go back to where it was before the conflict. So like different governorates have instituted claims procedures to retake land that was confiscated. I think the Ministry of Justice has been ordered to review all land confiscations and all leases of public land. But it's a very fragmented system and not very clear of how it's going to be implemented. There's also a very ambitious transitional justice initiative. There's a transitional justice committee that has an incredibly wide mandate over land, which I will touch on in just a couple of slides. So another practical approach is, to build back better. So rebuilding stronger, faster, and more inclusively, and reducing vulnerabilities. I mean, with this, we're looking in particular at Ukraine. The World Bank has a huge investment in housing project in Ukraine, part of which is paying compensation via the compensation scheme for damages to housing. But one thing that we've been trying to pilot there is this idea of cadastral reconstruction alongside physical reconstruction. So cadastral reconstruction is possible in somewhere like Ukraine, where you've had a mostly functional cadastral system and land registry system. The problem being that it's not complete. So there are large parts of the country that are not contained, particularly in the land register, which is a bit surprising for a European country. But basically the idea is that around physical restructuring, you do cadastral reconstruction. And this is the type of thing that we've been doing, for example, in the West Balkans. We have projects in Serbia, Croatia, Bosnia, Kosovo now, which are just systematically going from cadastral municipality to municipality. And it's kind of almost a first registration light. So it's not really the first registration of property, but it's taking the records that exist, publicizing them within that community, and say, we're going to do corrections and updates to the cadastre and the land registry. And we're going to be here on these days, and if you have any questions, call this number. But basically you go and say, here are the records. If it's accurate, you don't need to show up. If it's not accurate, come with whatever documentation you have, and we'll correct it. And it's just kind of to clean up all those inconsistencies, so maybe borders weren't so accurate. A huge problem is, lack of implementation of inheritance. So sometimes you have a land plot with 40 or 50 people with a legal interest in the land plot just because no one's ever divided it or bought everybody out. So just cleaning up basically the cadastre and the land registry records alongside doing physical construction. So if there's a piece of land that you want to reinvest in housing or agriculture, just add a component that's looking at the cadastre and the land registry records and try to update them alongside of it. Because as I was told on more than one occasion, like nobody wants to hear that we need 40 years to do land registration for all of Ukraine, and we can't do anything with land until all of the land registration is completed. But I mean, I think that this is a kind of practical way of attaching on to the reconstruction, because the problem is you can't wait forever, and useful land doesn't sit vacant just because the procedures for addressing it aren't in place. Land gets taken over, and this becomes a whole additional problem. I mean, Syria also provides a bit of an opportunity to integrate with Build Back Better, but it's at a much lower stage of development. So things like mass digitalization of land records would be important, and just promoting systematic land registration, because so little land is actually included. And then finally, the transitional justice, because I know that it's a personal interest of mine, and I know it's an interest of the university as well. So my experience when it comes to transitional justice in the land arena is that there's a sense that it's a lot more successful than it actually ever has been. I mean, I worked in Bosnia, as I mentioned. I mentioned we had 220,000 claims. In 6 years, they were almost all adjudicated. So during my career at the bank, I also have a colleague, Yvonne Moreno, who used to work at the land restitution unit in Colombia. So at different times, governments would come to us and say, we want to do land restitution, tell us how. So this happened once with the government of the Philippines. They were interested in land restitution in Mindanao. And Yvonne and I presented them. We kind of came up with this almost like, here are the 10 things you need to ask yourself before you even consider a land restitution process, because it often involves the very difficult prioritization of rights, which politically is very difficult. I mean, someone's getting the land and someone's not getting the land. I mean, that's the reality of these things. And picking, the time and the date, and, everyone tends to focus on the most convenient date for them or their community. So it's like, no, it should be 1945. No, it should be 1932. No, it should be 1906. And, governments often don't want to make that decision. And compensation schemes, I mean, in my experience, compensation is like a very logical response. It makes sense saying, just give everybody money, everybody will be happy. I have not seen a compensation scheme work anywhere in a large scale post-conflict land administration process. I would be happy to find out I'm wrong. In Bosnia, there was a constitutional right. It was actually in the constitution that you had the right to compensation. Nobody ever received compensation because the government said, we don't have any money. And the international donors said, we don't want to fund ethnic consolidation. So nobody wanted to fund compensation. If you wanted to go back to your house, they would rebuild it. But if you didn't want to go back to your house, you didn't get compensation. So, I mean, even in the Bosnian context, this was also very limited. I mean, it was only for private property. So things like social housing weren't included. The clock was 1991, so people whose properties were nationalized under the Tito regime didn't get anything. People whose properties were confiscated during World War II and before got no solutions. It was just, we go back to this day. So it was very narrow, and it took a lot of time and money and effort to get it implemented because the government officials were in no way interested in actually implementing this part of the peace agreement, and they more or less had to be forced into doing it. And there were very uncomfortable situations around secondary occupation and eviction of people who were refusing to leave housing that they were no longer entitled to remain in. And those are all extremely difficult things to overcome, even with huge amounts of resources, political consensus, and a peacekeeping force, throughout the country. So Colombia is another great example. So I was reading up again today to just try to get a sense of where things stand since the last time I checked. I mean, I think they received 120,000 applications for registration via the restitution process as part of the victims program in Colombia. When I was there and we met with the Colombian government, they estimated they probably get somewhere around 350,000 applications. The number of applications is actually quite low. The time to adjudicate them is very slow. As I understand the process, although a compensation scheme exists, you don't get the right to pick whether you get restitution of property or compensation. You can choose a preference, but a judge decides which one it is. And again, as I understand the process, as long as the Ministry of Defense has declared an area safe, you don't get compensation because you can go back to your home. And we can have long conversations about what areas are safe and not safe. But even if the low number of claims, only 43% have been finalized. So that's not really massive progress. In Ukraine, they've started this process of compensation for damage to housing because of the Russian invasion or loss of access to your housing. So if there's an area you can no longer go back to, you can claim compensation. Part of the compensation scheme run by the Ukrainian government is you submit an application, and once you submit that application, they do a check to see that if you are the title holder and there's a digital document with that title. And the last I had heard, I think 2/3 of claims were stopping at that stage because the person submitting the claim was not legally registered as the owner. So, this is hugely problematic because, again, going back to if you don't kind of clean up the land register, this is going to prove problematic for a long time. And then I will finish with Kosovo, because this is one of, one day I want to write a blog about transitional institutions that never die. So I think this is one of these situations where in the post-conflict they created KPCVA, which is a verification agency. And one of its roles was to get a copy of the cadastre records that were taken by the Serbian army when it retreated to Belgrade. And once they got this back, they were supposed to go and re-verify against the current cadastre records, you know, the ownership, to identify people who were kicked out of their property because of their ethnicity. So basically trying to reverse people who had been driven off of their land. But, you know, after 25 years go by, the cadastre records are still sitting in Belgrade. If they were to come back to Pristina tomorrow, and the institution insisted on verifying every parcel, this would cause complete chaos to land rights and real estate markets. So it's kind of this idea that these institutions are set up, but when they maybe lose a little bit of relevance or their mandates might cause more harm than good, they kind of live on and on. So that's it for me. Thank you very much for listening, and I would be happy to get questions or anything, or compliments, comments or feedback. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Paul. I think we're supposed to sit at the front.
Yes, otherwise you'll be here.
There's some water beside your chair. Sorry, I should have it ready for you. So thank you, Paul. That was really fascinating. I was frantically making notes. It was really interesting to get your insights of a lot of the complexities of how this actually works in practice. Do we have any questions from our colleagues in the room? I thought you might have, Laura.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed a lot to hear your complete exposition about this important topic. I am wonder if maybe in your experience, how some governments should handle this kind of inequality distribution of the land, which is in some cases one structural cause or roots of the conflict, but at the same time they have to probably doing these policies about restitution of land that the conflict has caused. So I mean, it's not always that governments have to deal just with the restitution of land because of the conflict, but also they have to deal with probably some more deep causes related to an inequality distribution of the land. So I would like to hear in your experience, I don't know, what do you think about it, and what could be your advice for these cases? And of course, when I am asking this, I am thinking in my Colombian case, because I come from Colombia. Thank you so much.
We'll take both questions and then...
Okay, thank you. This was really, really interesting to listen to. Two questions from me. One, you didn't talk about diaspora ownership of land, which in the Bosnian context, and well, Kosovo too, in many contexts, obviously, is a big issue. I just would like to just hear some reflections from you about the role of diaspora ownership, if it makes a difference somehow in how, how to well, in a transitional phase, what the influence of of diaspora ownership might be. And then the other question comes from, I'm from Norway, and after the Second World War, the northern part of Norway was, completely destroyed when the Germans pulled back. And the rebuilding of houses went very quickly in the, from 1945 to 1950. But there was a big Sami and indigenous population in this area as well. And they were not so interested in these houses, and their concept of land, of course, was very different, and their needs were very different. So I'm just in this BBB, building better housing. I mean, to what extent does thinking around different ways of living, so to speak, factor into how you think about building better in the after conflicts or when reconstruction takes place? Thank you.
So I'll start with I think the easier one, which was around the diaspora. So interestingly, in Bosnia, when the land restitution process started, the government was interested in excluding from the restitution process anyone who had gotten a foreign citizenship during the conflict. So their argument was, if you left during the war and went to Sweden or the Netherlands, and now you have an EU passport, and you have a pension, and you have a social safety net, we have so few properties, why should we give them back? I mean, I think it was something around between 1/3 and 1/4 of the housing units in Bosnia were destroyed or damaged during the war. So there was a severe housing shortage. So why should we give this back to people who are being taken care of somewhere else? I think in Kosovo, I think it's been a very different experience because the diaspora has played a very strong role, and they're very active economically in Kosovo. I mean, if you go there, you just see it. They buy huge amounts of properties. The housing construction in somewhere like Pristina is like, I go, and then 6 months later I go back, and there's like whole apartment complexes being built. So the diaspora is investing huge amounts. They're putting a lot of pressure on availability of land. They're driving up, in some ways, housing prices. So this is another concern. But I haven't seen, it's a good question. I haven't seen so much about the role that the diaspora, I lived and I was based in Beirut for a while too, and I know that that's another place where, despite, the conflicts and the fragility, the diaspora tends to invest heavily. So you may be living somewhere else for years, but people tend to have an apartment in Beirut or somewhere else where they go back and forth. So that's definitely, there's definitely an element. I see a lot of it also between, it's not diaspora, but between the rural and urban. And when I was talking about earlier some of the misconceptions we're always trying to overcome, it was also this perception that, like, if you build it, everybody will go back to it. But, we saw a lot of examples where people have one foot in each place. So if you're displaced to an urban area, but really not that far from your rural home, like in Bosnia, it was a weekend home, or they planted crops there or something. Or what we saw a lot of was, elderly family members who could just rely on a pension going back, but people who needed to find jobs or wanted education for their kids didn't want to go back to rural settings where the services had declined dramatically. The issue of land redistribution in Colombia. So I think before the conflict, Colombia had was one of the most unequal when it came to land ownership. And I was reading about updating myself on Colombia today, and I'm pretty sure it's still the same situation at this point. But so years ago, we had the great colleague at the World Bank named John Bruce, who was kind of leading the land administration work. And he always preached that, post-conflict situations can be these great opportunities to change the rules. Like, this is when you can kind of step in, everything's broken, try to bring in some fixes. I don't know a lot of land redistribution programs that have worked particularly well. I don't know if in Rwanda, maybe, and I have a colleague from there, so if you want, I can put you in touch with them. But at least in the places I've worked, I've not seen very big land redistribution campaigns. Like I know in Ukraine now, I believe there's some draft legislation about providing agricultural land to war veterans. I know when I worked in Bosnia, there was a push to have housing for war veterans. So sometimes there's selected categories of people who might benefit from some housing or some small redistribution of land. I've seen, it's not really conflict, but like South Africa, I think that's been really challenging with the issue of restitution and redistribution of land. I've seen kind of not post-conflict, but post, Soviet or Eastern European land system transition. So places like Albania, where they did massive redistribution of agricultural land, but the plots became so small that they weren't really economically viable, and now they're trying to do land consolidation. So I think that sometimes there's this process of distributing and then realizing, well, maybe distribution in this way is not the best. I think Colombia is a very different example, but at least for me, I've not seen, I don't know, maybe Lauren, some ideas about the redistribution. And I'm sorry, you had one other question and I forgot what it was.
It had to do with indigenous people who live different lives, yes. And when you rebuild houses, the concept of property and land is, are different, and how to address that in an acute post-conflict phase.
Yeah, that's extremely difficult. I know also using the Colombia example, for the restitution, there are special procedures to return land to indigenous communities, but I think has been very, very difficult to implement. When it comes to housing, I think an important element of Build Back Better is consultation with affected communities. What exactly is it that they want? Government shouldn't be the only voice when it comes to what they think is best for society. So all of that has to be taken into account. What I've seen more is on the legal side of, extending recognition to different forms of tenure, which formerly had not been recognized in the past, although, that's extremely difficult to implement.
Thank you, Paul, and thank you, Lara, because I had the same question about redistribution, so I'll be stealing your notes later. I have a kind of two-part question for you, Paul, related to the question of political will, I guess. So it was clear from your presentation that these questions are politically and practically very complex, and you mentioned that the World Bank does have, in these post-conflict moments when states have a lot of competing priorities, there's a moment there to kind of try and influence them to focus on particular things. So I guess how can we, in the first instance, encourage states to address these issues? And then secondly, like you mentioned, the importance of equity, whereas we know in post-conflict or contexts emerging from conflicts, states there can be a temptation to attract a lot of international investment that might, I guess, come into competition with ideas of equity for the population on the ground. So I guess how can we, in the first instance, encourage states to address these issues, and secondly, to do that in an equitable way?
Yeah, there's a lot of competition for resources in post-conflict situations. There's a lot of opportunity for things like land grabbing. There's also sometimes a view of, the economic part of the reconstruction should take priority, so create the jobs, create opportunities. Sometimes this is large-scale investment in agriculture or things like that. So, land is a finite resource, and there's a lot of competition for it, and that's highly problematic. Because we work primarily with government we are a bank of governments, and they are members of the World Bank, and this is the main way that the World Bank moves financing is through loans to governments to implement. I think one of the most important things we can do is to continually demonstrate to governments the importance of making sure that they use land in the best public interest, which is not always, the most quick win. But yeah, I mean, it's always a difficult conversation. There's a lot of competition for resources. Everyone thinks recovery happens. I mean, I don't think there's any one consensus on how recovery happens best. So there's always going to be these arguments of what's the best use of scarce resources. But I think making governments aware of, what an investment would mean and what a non-investment would mean is often, the best thing we can do.
Thank you, Paul. Do we have any more questions from the room? Just checking my list because I was listening to your response. Sorry. Yeah, I actually wanted to come back to a point you raised at the start, Paul, about the perceptions around land tenure security and how they change, and you kind of mentioned that there's kind of various factors that feed into that perception of land security. I wonder if you could expand a little bit on what you think is going on there for people.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at a lot of the data that we're using from Prindex about the perception, is that I think the number one reason that people felt insecure about their tenure is that the people they were living with would kind of kick them out. So I divorced my husband, the family kicks me off the land or something like that, or the head of the family decides that someone else should have this plot. So that was, it was kind of this intra-family competition over land that was a driver. Expropriation by the government was also fairly routinely cited as a risk, and basically confiscation by non-state actors was seen as a risk. I mean, sometimes also, depending on the context, basically loss of land to commercial investment. So in Sierra Leone, this was a big problem around investments in palm oil, that people were losing access to their land because of palm oil investments. But it's it can be so incredibly local in terms of what drives perceptions. And like I said, it can fluctuate. One day everything's fine, and the next day you hear about what happened in the town next to yours, and perceptions change very quickly. But I was surprised always about the intra-family dynamic is a huge one. Yeah.
Thank you. I wanted to pick up as well, you touched on it in your presentation, and it perhaps links to Inger's second question as well, in terms of the kind of social meaning of land. And I guess when we're thinking about these questions, it brings us, I think, into an idea of a land as property, and maybe takes us away a bit from the other meanings that land can have. And I just wonder your reflections on that. Is there a way in which these processes can capture the meaning that land has for people?
Yeah, I mean, you're right, because when it comes to economic assets, there's an emotional attachment to land that you wouldn't maybe have to your bank account or your stocks or your salary, as important as those things are. I remember once in Bosnia, we used to try to go out and meet. We would go out to the displaced persons camps and talk to people about, the restitution process and things like that. And I remember once very specifically someone telling me, that the most important thing that was provided was that they were given back the opportunity to decide what to do with the land. That, their legal ownership was recognized and enforced, and then they could do whatever they wanted. And I think that had a huge emotional impact. I think also, because such a huge percentage of the population was displaced during the conflict, the fact that people felt that this was addressed in a way that put the choices back in their hands, I think, I don't know, it's just complete speculation on my part, but I think that had at least something to do with kind of the post-conflict stability, that there wasn't this whole movement of angry people around having been excluded from their land. But some people have incredible emotional attachments, and some people have zero emotional attachments to it. And I think, like I was saying a bit before, this concept of the social norms hardening in conflict, it becomes so much more important about, who lives next to me. So, I mean, even in the paper on Northern Ireland that I was rereading this morning, I mean, people's comments were, yes, I hated giving up my home, but I wanted to live somewhere where I at least felt safe. So, I mean, there's so many different factors that go into it. I mean, I had Bosnian friends who were able to get their properties back and didn't go back simply because they'd been living somewhere for 6 or 7 years, and their kids were in school, or their son had a girlfriend now and didn't want to leave. And it was very practical. It wasn't I have anything against anyone. It's not that I had lost my emotional attachment, but people become practical. It was also in the case of Bosnia, I have a job. I'm not going to move somewhere where I'm a minority and look for a job where there's few jobs. So, I mean, I think people always have to balance that emotion with the practicality of stability or moving forward.
Thank you. I found it really interesting, the land registration projects you mentioned in Sierra Leone and Kosovo and how the World Bank supported those. I guess, could you say a bit more about the capacity for the World Bank to interact with places in that way, in terms of kind of investing in that kind of civil society level to support some of these types of processes?
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, like the bank's ability to invest in civil society is incredibly limited. So, like I said, the main way we work is we lend money, and that's the big money. And that can only be lent to governments. It can't be lent to non-government entities. We have a lot of trust funds that have been set up so that the State and Peace Building Trust Fund, which I mentioned to you, has funded a lot of these legal aid programs. That's funded primarily by the Dutch, the Norwegian, the Swedish, the Danish, the German, and French governments. We have a Japan Social Development Fund, which also funds the program in Laos. But our ability to move a lot of money to civil society is extremely limited because it's just not the way that the bank has been set up. And there's also questions around sustainability. So I've seen a lot of instances where a donor comes in, you give a small CSO $5 million for 5 years, and they go out and hire a lot of people, and they provide a lot of services, and then the grant ends and the organization closes. When we first did this, our first project was Jordan. So Jordan was our pilot. So we thought, okay, we have like 5 years and $2.5 million, which was a huge amount to this Jordanian civil society organization. And what I realized is the best way we could operate was to give them some funding, give them some advice, and give them the space to try out different things, giving them the space to fail so that if something failed, the CSO didn't go bankrupt, and see what works. And hopefully after 5 years, you have a better system than you had when you started.
Thank you, Paul. It's really interesting to hear about those examples. Do we have any other questions? Yeah, Laura, do you mind using the microphone, Laura? Because some people are online. It's just on that seat, sorry. We have no microphone runners. Thank you.
No, that's okay. No, just one last question, and it's regarding to the duration of the long term of the restitution processes, because a lot of victims claim for probably get a more like a fast process in order to get the restitution now. In some cases, these kind of problems pass to one generation to the next generation, and it's so like not just sad, but also unfair that they spend probably all of their lives try to get back their land. So I am wondering, maybe you know some good lesson or good experience in terms of this kind of a restitution process that, I don't know, governments could carry out in a good term or in a reasonable term, I don't know.
So kind of no, is the answer to that question? I mean, look, I mean, for what Bosnia was set up to do, it was mostly successful. Okay, on compensation, it was complete failure. On restitution of properties, it was successful, but there was a narrow base. like, in a way, it was kind of the perfect storm of tools. So there was, I mean, I think there was one estimate that within the first 5 years of the war ending, $5 billion had been invested by international donors in Bosnia. So it's a huge amount of money, rare political consensus. So, you know, the American government, the European, like the Russian, like everybody was on the same side, which is people should get their land back and people should be incentivized to return. But even there, you know, if the UN wasn't there observing evictions, the process would have stalled because of secondary occupation. Like, nobody wanted to deal with that problem. So I think, like, on the land restitution part, it was quite successful, but it was very narrow. I mean, Kosovo, I think, was also quite successful in terms of restitution of properties itself. I mean, the claims were adjudicated, but also, like, all of these international bodies were set up to monitor and help implement. So there was massive amounts of resources that went into it that I don't see happening anymore. So whereas I think those of us working back then thought, like, okay, this is the trend, I think they've become kind of outliers that, you know, they happened, it worked, but it's, you know, those circumstances will not exist again. I mean, I read about Colombia this morning that they were saying it will take 100 years at this pace to finish restitution. South Africa is somewhat similar because the courts expanded the base of people who could file claims. So it's, you know, it's kind of never ending. But the downside, again, of the Bosnia one was that, you know, people whose properties were expropriated or confiscated before 1991 got no relief. They got nothing out of the system. So it's...
Thank you very much, Paul, again, and thank you everyone for joining us here in the room and online. We're at time, so I'll bring the event to a close. But yeah, it was really wonderful to have you here, and I learned a lot. So thank you very much.
Thank you.